My name is Jim Vanderwall with the Fraser Basin Council. Today's webinar is on best practices for air sealing and insulation in homes. This is part of our First Nations Home Energy Save program. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, this is an initiative that we've had underway for a couple of years now to work with First Nations and support organizations to try and help reduce energy use in First Nations communities, help people share stories on what's worked for them, and we offer learning events like today's webinar, and try to build capacity for communities around energy efficiency. So thanks to our many supporters who are listed on the page below. If you haven't done so already, please check out the webpage for this initiative. You'll find there's some updated information on community stories and learning resources. You can also subscribe to the email list so you stay up to date on events that are coming up. And if you've missed out on some past webinars, we've got recordings of the webinars available for folks. You can click on as you can see on the right hand of the screen. One opportunity that you'll see if you go onto the webinar, onto the website, is we do have some upcoming opportunities to support communities through our one-on-one support program. So this is a small amount of funding that's available to help kickstart some activities, primarily around training or some basic energy assessments. So feel free to check that out. It's up to $5,000 for 3 communities to do some of that work. Just a couple of reminders on webinar logistics. For those of you who haven't been on a webinar before, we'll be keeping the audio muted so that you can hear our presenter. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions. You can do that anytime through the question box, and we will read your questions out at the end of the webinar so our resource person can answer those. And as I mentioned before, any technical difficulties, send an email to fraserbasin@gmail.com. So today's presentation, as I mentioned earlier, is on best practices for air sealing insulation. This topic has come up many times in our past events and workshops, and many people wanting to learn more about the details of how this works. We know that a number of communities are carrying out projects, and so today's presenter is Finch, who's with RDH Building Science, and he's going to be talking a bit about some of the best practices and not best practices that they've seen in their work in terms of air sealing and insulation. Graham's a building science engineer who specializes in research and investigation work and leads RDH's research group, and his work experience includes a wide range of projects, including building enclosure condition assessments, forensic investigations, research studies, energy assessments, many other things. And he's worked with numerous building product manufacturers on testing and development. Graham's authored several publications and industry guideline documents around durable and energy efficient building enclosures. And he's also a part-time instructor at BCIT's building science program at the diploma and master's levels. Now, before I hand things over to him, I've just got a couple of polls that help us know who's participating in today's webinar and just another introductory question. So first, we're going to ask you to tell us which type of organization you're with. Okay, so we'll just close that off and share the results with you so you can see kind of pretty evenly split between First Nations administration, consultants, other levels of government, and non-government organizations. So great to see. One other question, and this maybe applies more to folks who are with communities, but others as well, is if you've ever done air sealing or insulation retrofit work in homes in your community. Okay, so it looks like, again, we've got a mix here. We've got some people who've done extensive work and some who've done some work and some that are either planning to do work in the future or haven't really done any work yet. So that's great to see, and that's helpful for us to know so that we can think about how the information is presented here. So at this stage, I think what I'll do is just hand things over to Graham, and he will take us through his presentation. And we can have some questions and answers when he's done. So welcome, Graham.
All right, good morning, everyone. You guys hear me there? I'm pretty sure you can.
Yep, sounds
great.
Good.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll get started. Okay, so I'm here today to talk about best practices for weatherization work, which is essentially air sealing and insulation retrofits in homes across BC. And this presentation is sort of a culmination of a bunch of research we've done, guides, and some past projects we did for the utilities to look at how effective things were going as part of their utility retrofit program. So there's a lot of applications here to the group here. And I'm going to sort of share some of the stories and lessons learned and sort of get you in and out of here by lunch with a bit more understanding about better practices for how to approach this type of work. So I'm going to start with a bit of a background just to get you guys primed up and ready for discussion. Then I'll talk briefly about the building science for both air sealing and insulation retrofits, and then helping your community sort of prioritize work and getting the best return. What are the easiest things to go for? And then some fun, things to watch out for, common mistakes, and I'll sort of share some of those lessons as we go through here today. So we're talking about insulation and air leakage. And one of the easiest ways to see the missing insulation or lack of insulation or good insulation and air leakage is through infrared thermography. So infrared thermography is a picture you take from the outside of the inside of the building when there's a temperature differential between the inside and the outside. And what it allows you to see is hot and cold temperatures on the surfaces of the building. So this house here in the Lower Mainland, it's a wintertime shot. And what you're seeing there, you're seeing some windows, you're seeing some leakage around the windows at the top, you're seeing some heat loss up around the soffit here, a lot of potential thermal bridging and air leakage around this sort of lower roof. This window here is probably open. So you get a general sense of what you're looking at. And if you're doing this type of work, this is an extremely useful tool to help you understand and find out where you have problems. And the great thing about infrared thermography now is that you can actually buy cameras that go onto your iPhones, your Android phones for a couple $100s that allow you to, maybe not the resolution like this, but at least be able to see where some of the big problems are. And it's a tool that we use regularly as part of this work. So if I were to show you this picture, thinking there at home, what are some of the things you're seeing in this picture? So you can think about it for a bit. It's a wood frame building. So these vertical lines which stand out are studs, and that's conduction, that's heat loss right through the wood framing, and there's probably a bit more wood framing or maybe a pipe in the wall here as well. And then I'm seeing a lot of hot areas at the roof, and that's likely associated with air leakage. There's a chimney here, there's probably a light here, and then some leakage there as well. So it's a tool, and it helps us find things. If we go to the inside of a building, this is a shot sort of looking at outward at a corner. You can see a window to the right here. We've got our studs, we've got our plates, and we've got a really cold spot here. And this is likely associated with just thermal bridging there. So it's probably a little uncomfortable near that corner. Things to look out for on these images, you might just see a huge area of blue between the studs, and that would indicate that the insulation's missing. You can sort of look at how windows are performing in attics. If you look here, this is looking at a ceiling, right? And the ceiling here, we can actually see a fair amount of missing ceiling insulation. Up near the top here, you can see these areas where the insulation is either poorly installed or missing. And this is also a useful tool to commission retrofit work. So if you're doing an attic insulation retrofit work, you can check your work after with something like this, or the homeowner can, to confirm things are done properly. So when we talk about weatherization, it's funny, you Google weatherization, you'll probably find this picture, and we sort of snagged it there from Google. And this is a beautiful attic. It's clean, and it's made out to be something that's easy, it's dry, it's clean, And for those on the phone who have done this work, they know that it never looks this nice, right? It's never this easy. This is the attic, and somehow you've got to crawl around in there with a tool belt and do some air sealing, and you can see the nails, coming down through often the sheathing. You're gonna hit your head on or snag your new shirt on. So it's a bit of a challenge. And you're often climbing in and out of attic spaces and attic hatches, like this one in here. This is someone's house that we looked at as part of the retrofit program assessment, and we crawl into all these little nooks and crannies and sort of assess what the contractors have done and what needed to be done in these homes. And what you are going to encounter is a lot of building science. You're going to encounter problems with moisture. And this attic here, you can see staining. There's actually liquid water sitting on the underside of the sheathing. You can see mold growth. And so you're going to encounter some building science problems, which through weatherization you can solve, you can fix, you can address these, so you can improve the air quality in the home as well. And you also can use this as an opportunity to fix this type of problem before it becomes a serious structural problem. And as you're going into these spaces, this is a crawl space and a job we looked at just south of the border, and you can tell from this picture and the mold growth around this entrance to the crawl space that this is just going to be a whole bucket of fun, right? You can see the mold growth. You can see you've had to pull back the carpet to get into this space through their hatch, and this is what you encounter. Okay, well, for the obvious one there's that's not glass, that's water. There's about 6 inches of water in this crawl space, and oh, hey, the insulation from the ceiling fell down. And you look around, and that's probably the least of your worries, but you can see that some work was done at some point to insulate this crawl space, but there's a much bigger problem. And part of this, the nice thing or good thing I guess you'd say about weatherization work is it allows you to find these problems before they become serious structural issues as well. So it gives you an opportunity to quickly scan your community housing and identify the candidates that need to be repaired, and places like this, fix them up quickly. You can see the rotten structural framing here. This has been a problem for some time. This is pretty extreme, but we do encounter this from time to time, and I'm sure you will as well. So weatherization is essentially identifying heat loss in the building enclosure, both air leakage and heat loss from missing or minimal insulation. The way we built homes, decades ago, they were leakier and they didn't have as much insulation. So when you compare those homes to current build or code build homes or higher performance homes, they're lacking. And people living in those homes have comfort issues, they have moisture issues. And so this is an opportunity to fix those, right? This is the time when we can address indoor air quality issues, we can address comfort issues, and it can be relatively easy as long as you find the problem. So it mainly consists of air sealing work, right? So plugging holes, as well as installing new or topping up on old insulation. At the same time, other building enclosure repairs and improvements can be made. Window upgrades sort of fall under weatherization, and if you're re-siding, there's opportunities there to add more insulation into the walls. The purpose of weatherization is primarily for comfort, but it also improves or reduces your energy bills because you're reducing the amount of heat you need, and improves the building enclosure durability. So there's a lot of win-wins, and it can be done relatively cost effectively as long as you're targeting the right things. So when you look at a home, a typical home is a 2-story home with a basement and a crawl space here just for visual context. When you look at the areas, right? So the attics, if you go look in an attic, especially an attic that's easy to get into, they're very easy to retrofit and it's very common. Almost, the vast majority of retrofit work in BC is done in attics. When you look at the utility programs, the majority of insulation upgrades are done in attics, and there's a good reason. They're easy, they're cost effective, and they're relatively easy to do. Floors and crawl spaces. So crawl spaces, when you have a vented or unvented space underneath your house, again, they're easy to get into, therefore they're easy to get insulation into the places needed. I'll talk about crawl spaces a bit more later on. Other places, so if you have, say, a cathedral ceiling or a compact roof, a flat roof, so say your framing and your insulation was up here and your ceiling was sloped like that, it's harder to access. So they're less common, can be done if there's a big issue, but it requires a lot more work and cost. Exterior walls, in BC we do have a fair number of older homes, but most homes do have at least some level of insulation, in them, except for some very old ones built before the 50s. And when you look at this, in these walls, they're very hard to renovate because you got to either pull off the siding or put holes in the siding on the outside or put holes in the inside. So they're fairly intensive. It can be done. There's a fair amount of work where people blow in insulation into the wall cavities, but it's not necessarily as effective as, say, doing something else. And in particular, if you're adding more insulation into your walls, but maybe have the old leaky windows, single glazed windows, you're not getting a lot of bang for your buck out of that. So you'll do walls, but typically, sort of a third or fourth string down the list. And then other locations, floor headers, overhanging windows, things that are, protrusions or easy to access locations. If you can get insulation where it's missing, then it's a great thing to do as well. So when you look at insulating homes, there are many different types of insulation on the market. We're all pretty familiar with probably bad insulation. You've probably heard of foam, plastic insulations and spray foams, cellulose or blown in or bats. And there's dozens of different types and many more manufacturers. When you look at insulation, it's rated in terms of what's called an R value. Okay, and an R value is its rating of thermal resistance. So higher R value means less heat flow. And most insulation products have an R value of between 3 and 6 per inch. Okay, so like attic insulation that we blow in is 3 per inch. So if we add 20 inches of insulation, we get to R60. Okay, it's a simple multiplication from a simple, from an insulation standpoint. Or if we put, 10 inches of spray foam at 6 per inch, then we get R60 as well. The reality is once we put the insulation into the studs and into the joist spaces, we lose some of that effective R value. But for wood frame homes, it's, you get some degradation, but it's fairly close. Code minimums tend to range from currently from R15 to R20 for walls. So that means you have, in general, around 2x6 wall, 5.5 inches of insulation. Older homes with 2x4 framing probably have around R9. Older homes with no insulation, you're getting around R3 or so just for the air and the nether materials. And when you look at attics, code targets are R30 to R50. So when you're doing a retrofit, you're typically trying to at least hit that code minimum or higher if possible, knowing that the code is constantly ramping up and that if you're doing this work now, you might as well make it last in the future. Another big part of the work, and actually probably the primary part of weatherization work, is air sealing. Okay, and in air sealing, again, where you can access the locations of leakage. And talking about finding the leaks, we'll talk a bit about more later on. But looking at, into an attic or a crawl space where you can see where the air leakage is occurring into those spaces. So crawl spaces, attics, big holes and penetrations around ducts and other things in exterior walls, and foundation walls and basements, the concrete interfaces, concrete to wood interfaces. Those historically were never sealed and they're quite leaky in older homes. So when you're trying to identify homes that could benefit from weatherization, it's a bit of a sort of a condition assessment or a sort of process, or you could just know that a really old home needs some work. But it starts with a visual assessment. A visual assessment goes into the house, you walk around, you talk to the homeowners if they're home, but you're looking into the attics, you're making an estimate of what's in the walls and the crawl space. You're crawling around just like those pictures earlier on. You may do, so you measure the thickness of insulation, what's there. This old house here had 2 inches of wood fiber insulation, and then they at some point added another 6 inches of fiberglass. And you know, the retrofit was looking at blowing in another 10 or 12 inches on top of that. A blower door test. Blower door test can be used to determine where the air leakage, how leaky the home is, and then you can run around with smoke pencils, vaporizers. Vaporizers is actually really good for this. If people that smoke, or even if you don't smoke, just having a vaporizer to do testing and not smoke it. Infrared scans, you can see here an infrared scan found some issues with air leakage above this window, which you sort of identify visually and then go try to seal it. And then this area here of missing insulation in that attic. So the if in terms of prioritization, if you got a large housing stock, or if you're identifying even in your own home, you want to go for the poorly insulated, those places where there's no insulation or very little insulation, below code levels, and the easy or cost-effective locations, right? And when you look at homes that are really leaky, let's just say, for example, tested a house and it was 15 air changes per hour. You might want to target that one over something that's maybe 2 air changes per hour, which is much more tight. So in terms of assessing retrofit work, and this graphic is actually in a guide, which I'm going to talk about later on. This is sort of a useful sort of matrix to sort of help you understand what, where you can put insulation and how you can do this. What we're going to talk mainly about today are attics, because they're easy, and crawl spaces as well, because they're also easy and they're quite common. But there's also guidance on flat ceilings, above grade walls, floors, and other components as we get into them. Okay. So, sort of a couple of words of caution before you get into this. When you add insulation or you do air sealing work, it impacts how the building performs, and this is known as house as a system. So, as we air seal a home up, it puts more reliance on the HVAC system to operate properly and ventilate that home. This is a good thing, right? We want to tighten up the home for comfort and energy, and then use the mechanical system to ventilate that home. Now, if there isn't mechanical ventilation, we may consider adding it, and that's in a lot of utility retrofit programs. We'll add a bathroom fan that's quiet and it runs continuously in the center of the house, and that helps to ventilate that house after air sealing work's done. But you also, if you don't do that, then you can run into problems with humidity levels going up, the indoor air quality going down, durability potentially getting worse, and having issues with moisture and energy. So these things need to be looked at in concert. So if you're doing air sealing work, don't forget about ventilation. Also, don't potentially forget about how your combustion appliances are going to work. So if you're doing a really good job, the more you may run into these problems. Now, that's not to say don't do a good job. It's to say that if, be aware of what the consequences could be, how to test for it, and how to address it. And a lot of these standards are already there, so it's fairly easy for you to get into this with a fairly low risk. Okay, so don't be scared away, but need to be aware of some things. And so when you look at the potential health and safety challenges with homes and doing this type of work, if you add, make the house substantially more airtight, you do a lot of work, and you do a really good job, and you don't have makeup air, you can end up with backdrafting of fireplaces and combustion appliances. And this can be easily addressed. There are procedures to test if this is going to be an issue, and fairly simple measures to mitigate, including adding makeup air to the furnace system or into, passively into the house. You're going to be potentially encountering confined spaces. You may be exposed to VOCs from different materials, lead paint if you're doing work on the inside, asbestos in a whole bunch of different materials, including really old attic insulation, and then potentially, running into mold, right? So being prepared, and the guide that we put together actually talks a lot about these and sort of steers you towards the WCB and their documentation to be aware of. You may also encounter structural issues, issue with electrical systems and plumbing, and if it's your housing stock, this may be a good thing, so you can help identify those problems before they become too big of an issue. So we're going to look at attics in a bit more detail. So if we look at an existing home here with an attic, we've got our, our lights, our pot lights, our other fixtures in there. We've got bathroom fans. We've maybe got a dryer duct and fans running up from down below. We've got some small amount of insulation that was installed there decades ago. And we're going to look at how this attic works, right? And so when we look at existing attics, especially on older homes, they're really leaky, right? And they're leaky pretty much everywhere, right? They're leaky, you know, all sorts of potential locations, you know, around chimneys, around bathroom fans and exhaust fans, around pot lights or other light fixtures, around exhaust ducts, around framing. You'll get big holes sometimes that go all the way from crawl spaces into the attic, which, you know, usually have moisture issues associated with them. So big holes, right? Things that you can fit through. Plumbing, the interior framing, both at the inside and the perimeter. And then if you have, say, knee walls here, then you have leakage from the house into that conditioned attic space. So there's lots of holes to potentially plug. And the challenge is with weatherization is finding those leaks, right? They're, you know, if you had X-ray vision, you'd see this. And the reality is you're going to see something like this, even in a existing home that has some minor amount of insulation. You know, this one's being topped up a bit, but you can see that it's going to be, you know, kind of swimming around blind trying to find these holes. So that's where tools like infrared and other, you know, things can help. You sometimes in really old attics with really poor insulation, you may end up stripping all that out anyways, and you can do smoke testing or air leakage testing to find those leaks and see them. And they're also sometimes very obvious, like this one, right? So, you know, one of the ways to find a leak is to look for potentially condensation. And you can see here, there's something going on here. There's actually a bathroom exhaust fan, which was very poorly installed, and all the ductwork is leaking, and you can see the frost and the condensation and the staining that's resulted from that. So part of the weatherization work is actually fixing that, cleaning this up, and then it should be good to go. So attics, the way they work in BC anyways, is that you have insulation and you have some air tightness on the inside, especially an older one. And older attics like this, where you've insulated on the ceiling, is they're intended to be ventilated. And ventilation tends to come in at your soffits, your gable ends, and out your ridge. And that ventilation is there intended to take away small amounts of moisture, reduce the heat buildup in the summertime, and also help reduce the instances of ice damming or icicle formation on a house. If you got a lot of icicles forming on your house or you have ice damming issues, it's probably associated with a lack of ventilation or air leakage or some other issue. But there are a lot of things going on here. And so when you're doing weatherization work, it's respecting what should be there and should be done. And so we want to keep the ventilation, but reduce this potential air leakage. Because if the air leakage isn't addressed, it's bringing with it moisture, which will condense on the cold sheathing of your roof. Okay, so if we were just to go into an attic and blow in insulation, we would make the attic more insulated, which is good. But as we add more insulation to the attic, the sheathing also gets colder because there's less heat loss, right? More insulation, good for energy, bad for heat loss, which means that things outboard of the insulation get colder. So what happens is when we add more insulation, if we don't address the air leakage, so we had the same leakage we had before, the problems can actually show up for the first time, or they can get worse. So one of the worst things you can do is, unfortunately, add insulation to an attic without addressing the air leakage, in at least in some manner, especially the larger leaks, especially your ducts and your big holes. Okay, so when you're doing insulation, you're also doing air sealing, and the reason you're doing that is to reduce the chance of condensation and that risk there. So when we talk about attic work, it's about air sealing and insulation together. Now, what's interesting is if you look at this and you look at how historically utilities have incentivized this type of work, they will incentivize and pay you for insulation, but they won't pay for air sealing. Okay, and that's changing, and now there are incentives for air sealing with insulation. And I consider it best practice. And if you look at utility programs for low-income housing, it's a mandatory to do air sealing with insulation. So as part of your programs, that's something that definitely needs to be considered together. Simple things. Attic hatches are notoriously, fairly leaky. Attic hatches typically consist of a sheet of gypsum that's cut, sort of roughly around the opening with a foam gasket that's moderately airtight, and then insulated on top. It can be insulated with bats in a bag or styrofoam insulation like this picture here. As we get to deeper amounts of insulation, so say we've got 20 inches of insulation, you can imagine 20 inches of insulation would want to spill into your house every time you open up your attic hatch. So part of the work of the weatherization might be building a baffle around with wood. You could use bats. You can also see on this attic hatch here too, although it's not as pretty as the other one, actual handles that sort of compress the hatch onto the foam gasket. And we find that in some really humid and air leaky homes, you need to go to this level of effort to make that airtight enough. Although by the time you start adding weight and things on here, it can also help compress that gasket. So it's very common to see problems with attic hatches. You'll go in and they'll look like this. You can see a bit of staining here, and if you looked up into the attic here, you'd probably see a bit of condensation around this. Unfortunately, we find a lot of attic hatches in children's rooms, and the mold growth in the attic is not great for their health, obviously. And it's one of those first areas to target there. And you can see here too, poor use of gasket, and you really want to get a gasket that's airtight, sort of like a weather stripping gasket that also compresses a bit and becomes more airtight as you squish it down. Another big problem we see in attics are associated with pot lights. So any light fixture that penetrates through the ceiling into the attic. These units here are notoriously air leaky, especially older ones. And the other challenge we have with pot lights is, especially older ones that were installed in houses in the last few decades, is they aren't rated for insulation contact. So it's non-IC. So IC stands for insulation contact. So you can get IC rated, which means it's insulation contact rated, or non-IC. And then AT stands for airtight. And so you tend to run into non-IC, non-AT units all the time because they were cheap and easy to install in the 80s and 90s. And the way to address that is you actually have to build a box, and a fireproof box at that, with separation away from these pot lights, because if you bury them in insulation, you can actually start a fire. And that's because they're not made to, and what happens is they heat up too much and the wiring can fail. It can heat up too much. It's not rated for that temperature, or the fixture itself. So you can build a drywall box and air seal it around. You can't insulate over top of them, unfortunately. So you end up with at least it's more airtight, but you do lose some R value there. Or you can get these, mineral wool boxes that you can sort of slap on over top. So just sort of a warning there, and so you can sort of see the typical sort of box over these old fixtures. You can't dump any type of insulation over top of them; they're just not rated for it. So what we're seeing is it is a lot of work to build these boxes. It may be more prudent to actually replace these, having an electrician there replacing them with say an LED or a smaller sort of puck type unit, or something that is rated for insulation contact. This can obviously will add cost, but it is the safer way to do it. Otherwise, you're building these boxes which aren't as effective and don't really address the heat loss there as well. Another issue that you can run into is if you've got combustion appliances, so older, not newer, but older, non-unsealed combustion furnaces and fireplaces, gas flues. These metal ducting gets very hot. It needs to be separated from fiberglass and cellulose insulation, otherwise you can catch it on fire. This is typically achieved by air sealing around the duct with the fire caulking, and then having these sort of shrouds and the insulation gets poured up to it. Or you can use non-combustible mineral wool insulation around here and then blow the insulation up to it. And all these details, by the way, these graphics, they're all in that guide, which we'll talk about later on. You can download and sort of follow them as you need. Chimneys, masonry chimneys, another thing that also have to be separated for combustion, especially in case of chimney fires. So there's when you go into these homes, these old homes, there's like a 2-inch gap all the way around your chimney with this maybe stuffed a bit of insulation in there over the years. The air sealing for that is, fire caulking and sheet metal, or using mineral wool to sort of keep the fiberglass away. We find this sort of approach actually more effective as long as you're also doing the air sealing at the base of the detail there as well. So air seal it, then insulate it, then dump the rest of the insulation in. So common deficiencies we have seen, we do tend to see, insulation blowing right up against hot furnaces or hot ductwork. It needs to be sort of pulled back. You can actually see in this picture here, there's that shroud that someone has done that's completely acceptable there and works quite well. So again, you don't want to go in and do work that makes a house less safe. Right? Other things you're going to run into that aren't necessarily going to fall into your scope of work, but sort of in terms of what you plan to do, is you're going to run into weird things. You're going to run into places where people have installed a dryer or a bathroom fan and ran it into the attic, but never connected it to a duct. Right? You can see the weatherization contractor came in here, they blew in 20 inches of insulation, which is about our 60, but there's this flex duct that's exhausting a dryer with warm, moist air into this attic, which is cold, which results in condensation. You're also going to run into situations where old ducts and things have become disconnected, and those need to be reconnected there as well. So part of your work is making sure you don't have ducts and other things exhausting to the attic. If they do, you need to add a vent. Other locations, so when you look at air sealing, these perimeter walls are quite leaky. One of the strategies to air seal them is using spray foam or other material sealants. Your plumbing penetrations potentially have some movements, so providing a flex joint around those. When you get into dividing, these are the dividing walls there, and if you put a bit of air pressure on here, you'll just see tons of air leaking all the way through here because they're essentially connected all the way through the house. So you can see some partial work here, an attempt to do some spray foaming, but they've missed the bulk of leakage. And when you actually smoke test this, they sealed up that hole, which was good for the electrical, but they missed a whole bunch of other leakage. Sorry about that. Attic insulation, as you're blowing in more insulation, you tend to blow in 1 to 2 feet of insulation on top of the existing. If you do that in an existing home without addressing the baffles, that insulation could spill out, right? It'll spill out into your soffits. So part of the prep work is installing insulation baffles that retain that insulation, and where you don't have baffles, we tend to use rolls of fiberglass batt that keep the blown insulation from spilling over into that soffit space. Okay, so if you're blowing something that's nice and loose and fluffy, making sure that it doesn't blow out of the building is key. When you're looking at this, it should be pretty obvious that the insulation, you want 20 inches of insulation, you should get 20 inches at a pretty uniform, thickness. You can see here that there's only about 3 inches of insulation in this house there, so it's getting a top up. But you sort of want to make sure this blown in uniformly. Here's some examples of what it should look like, both with a couple different types of fiberglass. You can see in this house here, the weatherization contractor added insulation baffles at every single joist base because they found that easy. It also keeps the insulation from going in. And you can see here is sort of like a sea of insulation. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, we see this, right? This is, some contractors gone in, being pretty lazy about their blowing in. Also realizing that this is probably only 2 feet to get into there, so difficult access, but things, rakes, and there are techniques to get the insulation nice and uniform. You're paying for this stuff, and this is your old insulation, which isn't enough, and you're getting kind of ripped off here, right? Sort of like getting half a paint job, right? And you can see here sort of the same sort of situations again there as well. When you're talking about insulation in attics, blown in fiberglass, cellulose, mineral wool, whether it be blown in or bats are the products to use. We occasionally run into cases where people try different types of insulation. Reflective foils are something that are sometimes tried in attics. Unfortunately, they don't work. They market as, say, maybe an R20 blanket, but the reality is they're, well, maybe R1, right? Because there's no insulation value there. They do help reflect heat, and they're sometimes used in hot climates, sort of draped underneath the roof deck to sort of reduce inward heat gain in the summertime. However, they're not as effective as just adding insulation, and it's a lot cheaper to add insulation. And in this particular house, the foil was on top of the insulation on the cold side, which also created a moisture problem. Right? So if you run into this, somebody wanting to use it, or an existing house with it, rip it out or don't use it. There's certainly applications for it, but this is not one of them. Just to sort of hit things home, like trying to find those air leakage points. If you where your partition walls are coming up, just skirting the insulation out and sort of digging it around, vacuuming it out if you need in those locations so you can see them. Around pretty much every old duct is going to leak. It's pretty much guaranteed that a duct that was installed in the 70s and maybe retrofit a few times, depending on the equipment, is probably leaky. So you can almost guarantee that you're going to find some holes there to seal up. And if you don't, like I talked about earlier on, you're going to run into condensation problems. Now, these are condensation problems in, where there's been a fair amount of leakage. The thing with weatherization work is if you're in an old attic and there wasn't a lot of insulation to begin with, you may not see these problems because there's so much heat loss and it was drying things out. If you've got a well-insulated attic and you have these problems, this is where you tend to see these problems. If you do a good job of the insulation and you don't do a good job of air sealing, you could be called back or create this problem in someone's home years later. So looking at Crawlspaces now. So Crawlspaces is another easy area to access, and Crawlspaces, for whatever reason, across the province, were either very poorly insulated or not insulated in many areas. So when you look at a crawlspace, not a basement, although sometimes basements can be similar to this, you got your floor joists here, you've got your concrete crawlspace, you probably got dirt instead of concrete underneath here, and you probably got the framing sitting right on the dirt. But there's a vent, typically on a couple sides, where outdoor air can get in. So this is essentially like an attic, but upside down, right? Or an attic's an upside down crawl space, whatever you think of first. So in terms of crawl spaces, we've got moisture from the ground, soil grasses from the ground. We've got a lot of air leakage indoors, we've got cold floors and comfort problems potentially. And then we got ventilation from the outdoors, venting this space. So there are two approaches, and the first approach, which is not generally recommended, but sort of the, when you look at the two approaches, you got vented and sort of unvented, and I'll talk about the two of them there. But a vented crawl space is you take your existing crawl space, and if it's dry and you got decent ventilation, you'll add insulation into the floor, and you'll make the floor reasonably airtight to improve the comfort. And then the insulation's, you're crawling around in there stuffing in bats, and you're holding it up with chicken wire or some sort of other wire or string to keep it up on the underside of the floor. So that's a fairly easy retrofit. It still makes it outdoor space. Again, really reserved for dry crawl spaces and locations where you don't have potential moisture issues. You can't restore stuff in that space as well. The other option, which is really encouraged, especially nowadays, and a new home would sort of be built this way, is a conversion of your old crawl space to an unvented and a heated crawl space. So that essentially means your crawl space now becomes part of your conditioned area. And that means we need to put the insulation primarily on the walls, and if we can, or depending on where we are, we may also put it on the floor. Okay, and at least doing the walls and the headers and the joist spaces here. And so you're in the crawl space, you're using rigid foam insulation for this, not batt or spray foam, and you're getting it in, and then you're sealing the foam with tape and in spray foam maybe in the floor joists. This is a location where bad insulation doesn't perform well. It's obviously more expensive to use foam insulation, but it definitely performs better and it addresses the moisture issues. This allows you now to potentially condition, put storage down there. If you've got equipment down there, it's now nice and warm, and your floors will be warm. Okay, and there are procedures to do that in the code and in the guide I talked about as well. When you do that, your walls become part of the air barrier, so sealing cracks or sealing the foam to them, sealing the foam itself, outlets, other penetrations. You go into a crawl space. This is a or vented crawl space. If you are converting a crawl space from a vented crawl space into a unvented crawl space, then you need to plug these holes. And what we'll sometimes see, unfortunately, is people will convert the crawl space, but they'll leave the vents open. They're like scared to close it off. It is wise maybe to put a sort of a potential, tell people where the vents were, but you do want to seal this up. You can also see that a crawl space like this is going to be kind of difficult to get rigid boards of insulation cut and sealed in there. And so one of the reasons people are sort of hesitant to sort of do this work is because it is a bit tricky, but it is can be quite effective. Here's one we encountered. You can who can sort of spot the issue in this crawl space. Think about what's going on here. You've got floor framing insulation that was added, and this guy over here, electric baseboard on a thermostat, and so now they're heating essentially the outdoors, right? The homeowner at some point probably added this heater to improve the comfort, even though it was ventilated, which would have some impact. And they've insulated the floor. There's no need for this heater here anymore, which we found was running and cranked all the way to the max. So in crawl spaces, as mentioned, spray foam is good use in this application because it's easy. It air seals and insulates all in one, and it's easy, relatively easy to bring the hose in through a crawl space hatch, inside or outside. Do this work with the proper health and safety precautions. And get in and out in less than a day. So in terms of resources, there's a number of BC specific resources that you're fortunate enough to be able to get to. This guide here, which I've talked about, is currently available on BC Housing's website, or just Google best practices for air sealing and insulation retrofits. You'll be able to find this. We are currently putting the final touches on a 2017 edition of this. We're also working with the utilities right now to do hands-on weatherization training. So we've developed this little module that's meant to replicate an existing home, both a sort of attic condition, and if you want to, a crawl space, and show people hands-on the materials, how to do the air sealing work in sort of half-day or full-day seminar. So we're going to be working with utilities and our mainland contractors to sort of roll that in October, but that's something that hopefully the utilities will roll out to the rest of the province, and Elena there can maybe talk to you about that and maybe setting up something in your communities that's half day or full day training from weatherization contractors. So it's exciting because it's it's one thing to read and look at pictures in a book, but it's another thing to do it by hand. So the retrofit guide, the updated one, a lot of the graphics you saw in the presentation today from there, this will be coming out very soon. I'll make sure I let Elena know, and then she can post it on your website when it's out. It's just getting the final steering committee comments into it, and a few more things on crawl spaces that recently. But basically, there's a discussion of building science. It talks about where to prioritize, the graphics in there from earlier on. Bathroom fans, how to do them, and pretty much every detail that you could encounter. If you run into something new, shoot us an email and we'll add it into the next version as well. So it's really much a living document, and it's great because it's BC focused and addresses some of the unique climate challenges that we do have here. Other guides. This is if you're doing work, or if your community is really remote in northern areas. We did this work with First Nations groups in the Yukon and Northwest Territories and Unvented housing corporations a couple of years ago, and essentially it's a guide for essentially going through retrofits for homes. And if for those people that have been up to the far north and done any work up there, you know those houses are very unique. You know, they're sort of isolated on their own, very unique site challenges, permafrost. And so this guide was specifically for that type of home, but a lot of the same content material. And if you want that, you can Google Illustrated Guide for Northern Housing Retrofits, or you can find it on our website. So with that, I am finished, and we have time for questions. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Graham. Lots of details there, and I'm sure we all learned something through all of that. So we do have some time for questions if anyone would like to ask Graham something about his presentation. And while you're thinking about that, we'll just do one little quick poll here to see if folks are interested in the type of training that Graham was mentioning in terms of hands-on air sealing and insulation. Okay, well, we'll just share the results here. So yeah, it definitely looks like there's a number of people who are interested, some people that would like some more information. And so we'll certainly be sharing those opportunities when they come up. And if you're interested in having some conversations, certainly do get in touch with Elena or myself around these training opportunities.
No questions, eh?
No questions so far. Well, one question for you, Graham. So you've seen a number of homes in your work, and some good work and not so good. You focused kind of on the attic and crawl space. Are there any kind of areas you'd suggest people to focus on in the interior spaces, or common areas that you see air leakage?
Yeah, I mean, it's harder to find those other ones. So if you do an infrared scan or a smoke test with air leakage test, you can find those other holes, like in a wall or around windows, and then sort of address them there at the time. But they're harder to sort of universally say that you need to see all of these things. The other thing to consider in the back of your mind is if you need to replace windows or siding, that's the opportunity there to improve the insulation values and the air tightness, regardless of what you're doing. So looking at, if you're going to spend $1,000 in windows, looking at spending, $1,050 or $1,100 on slightly better windows that are going to give you a better return for that incremental cost. So what we're seeing now is if you're doing windows, instead of looking at, say, double glazed, cheap vinyl windows, you might look at a higher performance vinyl or a triple glazed window, because knowing that that's where the code is sort of going, and that in 10 years that's going to sort of be the norm, and that upgrade cost to go from double to triple can pay back in many cases. Yeah, so I do see a question there. What type of caulking can be used for sealing? That's a great question, something we get all the time. The best caulking is the one that sticks. And that's not the answer you want to hear, but it depends what you're sealing. So you got to look at what you're sealing, and is the joint potentially moving. There are lots of, if you look at acoustic caulking, which is that black butyl sealant, that's often used for a lot of things to seal interfaces as gaskets, so it can be used it's good for that. But it doesn't tool, and it's not good for sealing around pipes, and that's where you need to look at a hybrid or polyurethane or a silicone type sealant, something that's a little better type of sealant that will stick. Typically polyurethane sealants will stick to most things you're dealing with. Most silicones will as well. You just gotta, what you'll find in this work, maybe on the first house or your own house, try a few different ones out to the materials you're sticking to, and just make sure it adheres and stays bonded. and that's that's what we'll typically do. In the hands-on training, we'll have a bunch of different sealants and sort of be able to pull things and sort of look at how good they are. So.
There's another question here for you, Graham, is if you could elaborate a little bit more on closing the vent in the crawl space relative to insulating.
Yeah, so I mean, you're either going to convert that to a unvented crawl space, right, where you would want it sealed up, and the air barrier becomes the walls and the floor, right? So you put polyethylene on the floor, you put insulation on the walls, and you don't want holes into your building, just like you wouldn't want that hole into your bathroom or your bedroom upstairs. All right, so if you've gone to the case where gone to the work of insulating the crawl space walls and the headers and sealing the floor, there's no value in leaving those vents open. If you've only insulated the floors, then yes, you're leaving those vents open and making sure they don't get sealed off, because the air barrier there is actually the floor. And so the simple question, if you're in doubt, figure out what is the air barrier, where is the air barrier in this house, or where do I want it to be? And if the vents are part of the air barrier, then they get sealed off. Hope that helps.
Okay, thanks. Another person's asking about if you've got any sense of typical costs for a small home, say 1,100 square foot home to retrofit. I guess that probably varies quite a bit.
What type of retrofit?
Yeah, it's hard to say, I guess. I'm sure homes are in all kinds of different conditions.
Yeah.
But
let's just say that you can. Air sealing is mainly about a contractor's time, less so materials. So it's usually caulking and spray foam and other things, which are sort of maybe up to $100 for materials, but it's mainly their time. So if you've got a contractor in your house for a day, 50 to 80 bucks an hour, whatever they're charging out, you can do a whole lot in a day. You can do a whole lot in half a day. Some of the utility programs incentivize, say, 4 hours of air sealing. Right? So if you're really good, 4 hours, a couple $100. So air sealing work tends to be in the couple $100 to sort of sub $1,000 levels, especially for a home, unless you're running into really big things. Insulation is relatively cheap for an attic. Crawl space is a bit more, but you're looking at $1,000 or a couple $1,000 for the insulation and the work to get in there, or maybe less depending on the size of your attic. So to get in, you're spending, let's just say $2,000, and you may get a couple $100 savings on your energy bills, and it'll pay back within ideally sort of the 5 to 10 year or longer window. Plus you get comfort, and you get your partner and your kids not complaining about you for being cold anymore. So
do you have any thoughts in terms of a cost comparison between rigid insulation and spray foam in a crawl space?
Yeah, that's a good question. What we're seeing as part of the ECAP program is EPS insulation. So a white beadboard with a facer, tape joints is the cheapest way to do that. Although for very complicated ones, and if you've got a good local spray foam contractor, then and you need the guy or a woman with the truck to do this. You can't just do froth packs. If you've got someone local that can do it, they may be cost competitive with that, because you're just spraying versus the other one you're cutting, taping, sealing. So again, it comes down to time. Those can be similar. It's just going to depend on where you are locally. In really remote areas where you don't have spray foam boards, are going to be cheaper.
Okay, and just time for one other question here, which is just a clarification around some of the ventilation information you provided. So for in order to ensure adequate ventilation after air sealing and insulation, is a constantly running bathroom fan, such as you talked about that as part of some of the utility programs, enough, or is an HRV needed?
The bathroom fan, so when you look at the bathroom fan or HRV, you can get the same net flow rates, so they can essentially be the same. The benefit in HRV and why if you can, I would go to an HRV, is people are less likely to turn that off. But the biggest benefit is you get air that's coming in that's not cold, right? The air coming in through an HRV is preheated, and it's, if it's 0 degrees outside, it's 20 indoors, it's coming in around 16 degrees. So where the air comes in, you don't feel a cold draft. So HRVs will be more comfortable, and then you're also going to get more energy savings with an HRV than you would for a bathroom fan. So if you're dealing with a small home, say 1,000 to 1,500 square feet, a central HRV or ERV unit, like similar as Panasonic has one, and there's a few other small ones that you can pop up into drop ceilings. Those can go a long way, and they do a lot better than, say, a bathroom fan for getting effective ventilation. So both can work. An HRV is going to be more reliable, and a bathroom fan is going to be cheaper. So that's sort of your trade-off there. But if you can get a small HRV for a relatively low cost versus weighing that against bathroom fans and ductwork and other things, then it's something to consider for sure. I know right now for the utility programs, the bathroom fans are the most cost effective. The HRVs are less cost effective, so they're not typically doing it, just on their metrics.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're going to need to wrap things up for now, but appreciate all the information, and thanks everyone for the questions. So I'd like to thank Graham for his time in developing the presentation and also answering your questions. If you've got any follow-up questions, please do not hesitate to get in touch with Elena Chia or myself. I got our contact information up as well. And thanks very much for your participation. If there are a couple of additional questions we weren't able to get to, and so we will do our best to get Graham to respond to those by email afterwards. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks a lot. All right.
Okay.